Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar organised by Nordic Model Now. Our topic today is raising kids in a pornified world, which is the subject that we're tackling with Helen McDonald. Our next webinar in February is about OnlyFans and how it breaks down boundaries, and I'll give you details of that at the end. We're running this session as an online workshop, so after Helen's presentation, she'll also be answering your questions. And hopefully we'll be able to take as many as possible. We're planning to run the workshop for about 90 minutes, and you can type questions into the Q&A box at any time. I apologise in advance if yours isn't answered, but please understand that we probably won't have time to answer them all, and any questions we don't get to answer we'll use to help us develop future events. Can I remind everyone as well to please keep their questions on topic. I'd like now to introduce Helen, who I hope should be online and can join us.
I'm here, hello.
Hi, Helen. It's my pleasure to introduce Helen McDonald. Helen has worked with children and young people for over 20 years as a teacher, an advocate, and now as a therapist. Helen has extensive experience working with children and young people who've been subjected to sexual violence, as well as facilitating sessions with children and with young people on these issues of consent in relationships and the impacts of pornography. Helen has created resources which are used by school staff to approach issues of consent and to help them to support young survivors of sexual violence in school. I'd like now to hand over to Helen. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks so much, Emily. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we can get started. So as Emily said, we're going to be talking specifically today about practical ways for parents and anyone with any caring responsibilities for children and young people and those who work with children and young people to approach the issue of raising kids in a pornified world. So as Emily said, I have extensive experience of working with children and young people in a range of different roles, and hopefully the stuff that I share with you today you can know has come from a place of practical experience where I've actually used these techniques with young people. Okay, so how we're going to structure the session today is that we're going to look at four main topic areas. So we're going to start with what kind of pornified media content are children and young people consuming. We're then going to have a think about how can you have age-appropriate conversations about pornography and the sex trade. We'll then move on to how can you encourage children and young people to speak up if they feel unsafe? And then lastly, how can you support children and young people to recognise the harms of pornography and the sex trade? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about each area, give you some practical ideas. The session is being recorded. If you want to take notes, that's absolutely fine, but you'll be able to go back to the recording, have a look at some of these things at a later date. Okay, so let's get started with what kind of pornified media content are children and young people consuming. So first of all, I think it's important to make a distinction between sexualized content and pornified content. Although there is a connection between the two, for the purposes of our presentation today, I just want to make a distinction between them. So I will be talking about sexualized content as that which portrays a person, typically a woman or girl, as an object of sexual desire, typically for a heterosexual man. So sexualized content has existed as long as media has existed. So you can think of examples of adverts where women, while they're washing their hair with a shampoo, are portrayed as objects of sexual desire and as if they are experiencing sexual pleasure whilst that's happening. So I'm sure we can all think of lots of examples where media is sexualized. Now, I've said that that is typically a woman. There are examples where men and boys might be sexualized in media content, though the presentation does tend to be a little bit different. So what we're more interested in today is the idea of pornified content. So that would be any content that uses images, themes, and acts in mainstream media that have their origins in pornography. So although it might be that it's sexualized, it might not be as overtly, obviously sexualized as some other content. So I'd just like us to have a look at some examples, and the examples that I've picked all come from mainstream popular music. So what I've done is I've taken lyrics from these 3 songs that are all by mainstream pop artists, and I've picked out the lyrics that make reference to something that has its origins in pornography. So in the first example, the song is called Wish You Were Dead, and it's by Lola Young. I'm pretty sure Lola Young, with a different song, is currently top of the chart. So very popular new young musician. In this song, the lyric is, come around, fuck me nice, pull my hair, sing me lullabies. So in terms of looking at what is pornified content, the idea of hair pulling might be something that we say is something that's typically seen in pornography. Harry Styles, I assume, needs no introduction. In his song Keep Driving, it includes the lyric, cocaine, side boob, choke her with a sea view. So choking, which really is strangulation, is something that is very common in lots of free to access pornography. And then lastly, Stormzy in the song Bossy Bop says, getting freaky in the sheets, we're taking body shots, then finish with a facial just to top it off. And in that context, the facial refers to ejaculating into a woman's face. So the reason that I wanted to pick these examples is because they are absolutely mainstream and they're incredibly popular. But that's not to say that any of these individual people are doing anything deliberately in order to promote these ideas. Hopefully what this also shows is that this is very, very mainstream. So very normalized, the kind of songs that would just be played on the radio during the day. Okay, so another thing that I think it's quite important to bear in mind is, while, as the example showed, young people and children are being exposed to pornified content, references to ideas, acts that have their origin in pornography, children also have a lot of access to adult content. So in my day, when I was young, there were lots of what I call speed bumps that stopped young people being able to access certain types of content. So for example, on television, there were only 4, then 5 channels, and there was a watershed. So certain content could not be screened on TV until after 9 p.m. There was also age ratings on films to get into the cinema and on video games to play. So there were these ways that as a society we agreed we were going to restrict the kind of content that children could get easy access to. If you wanted to access pornography pre-internet, you either needed to go to a sex shop, which was licensed by the local authority and had to follow certain license restrictions, such as not having any window displays, having 2 doors in order to get in, and you had to be 21 to go into one of those establishments. Or you needed to go into a newsagent and buy a magazine off the top shelf, which meant that you had to be able to reach the top shelf. You then had to take that magazine to the counter, and it wouldn't be sold to you, hopefully, unless you were over 18. Now, we've moved from that situation where all of those speed bumps existed to a world where all kinds of adult content is available 24 hours a day to a device that lots of children and young people keep in their pocket. So I just want us to have a think about the kind of adult content that is available. So if we think about TV, we no longer have any kind of watershed. TV is on all day. You can just put TV on in the morning and there might be any kind of content just constantly streaming on one of the many channels. The same with social media, very limited restrictions on any kind of content. So lots of platforms, although they say you have to be a certain age in order to have an account, isn't particularly enforced, and there isn't really a way to do so. The music that we've already looked at, lots of pop music, will include language and references to sexual acts that, while in the past would have been there, they would have been more heavily disguised. So things are much more obvious now. We don't rock around the clock anymore. It's just said what rock was alluding to. And one that particularly interests me is the kind of adult content that is available in young adult novels. So there are several series of young adult novels that are targeted at young women in particular, that feature characters who are around 16, 17 years old. But the sexual acts that are described quite graphically in those novels are not typically things that you would associate with that age group. So there seems to have come an overlap between the kind of romance, spicy novels that are talked about on TikTok, on BookTok. The kind of sexual content of that seems to be trickling down into the younger novels, into young adult novels. So I think we absolutely do need to bear in mind the pornified content, but we also need to acknowledge that the reason that children are able to access a lot of this stuff is because of the erosion of those boundaries and barriers that kept them away from adult content. So I think it's really important to remember that children and young people don't know what content is age appropriate for them unless a trusted adult in their lives lets them know. So if you imagine if you had a young person, let's say they're 11 years old, they've just started secondary school. So they now have a mobile phone because they have to get the bus for the first time. Parent wants to know where they are. They may well be able to access content on that phone and be sent content on their phone by other young people that is completely age inappropriate for them. However, when they consume that, when they see that, they may have a physical and emotional reaction to it, but actually not know that this is something that at their age, it's not appropriate for them to see. So it's worth bearing in mind that it is super important to have conversations about that, which we'll come on to in a little bit. We also need to think about how adults can replace those speed bumps and barriers that are no longer provided by media platforms. So that would be thinking around monitoring internet use, talking to young people about the kind of thing that they're consuming. It's much more difficult to do that nowadays than it would have been in the past. You know, if you had to go to bed before 9 o'clock, you'd have to sneak downstairs to see the telly. Most young people will have a device that they can access in their bedroom and all that kind of thing. So it's thinking about ways that adults can replace some of those boundaries that stop children accessing content that is age appropriate. Okay, right. Let's have a look at our next bit. So let's think about then, we've got a context, we know young people are potentially accessing age inappropriate material that has a pornified content to it. How can you have conversations about pornography and the sex trade with young people? So if you have school-age children, there is government guidance that covers what should be taught in schools. Now, with relationship and sex education, there is always the option for parents and caregivers to remove their children from those sessions, and that it's worth checking with the school the content of the sessions, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. So in the guidance from the Department for Education, pornography as a topic is not covered at all for primary age school children. So they talk about consent in terms of friendships. So primary school, it doesn't come in at all. At secondary school, in the online and media section of the guidance, it talks about children being informed about the impact of viewing harmful content, and specifically sexually explicit material such as pornography, and how that presents a distorted picture of sexual behaviours, can damage the way people see themselves in relation to others, and negatively affect how they behave towards sexual partners. So that is that's a quote I've just copied and pasted out of the guidance. So if you have children who are secondary school age, this is what you should expect is being covered in their relationships and sex education. Often it's called PSHE, or the school might have another name that they use for those kind of lessons. So what I just want to have a look at now is those of you who have school-age children, what you might want to talk to the school about if you're worried about the kind of content that they're doing. Like I say, you can always ask about what it is they're covering. So I'm just going to share some information about a couple of organisations that you can have a look at who do provide some guidance on how to address these issues in school settings. So ICENA is a social enterprise, and its profits go back into services that support survivors of sexual violence, and they offer a range of resources on how to talk about consent in romantic and sexual relationships, and how to talk about pornography with young people. So they offer kind of ready-made lesson that can be used, and guidance for the teacher who's going to be facilitating that lesson. So you can check those out. There's also the day program. So the day program is a program for school-age children that covers domestic abuse, so abuse in relationships and relationships with abusive people. If you go to the website dayprogram.org, there's also a video that you can watch called Creepy Naked Stuff, that is a free resource that helps parents and caregivers and adults who work with children to have conversations when children have seen things online that has made them feel uncomfortable. So I definitely recommend going to have a look at that. And there's also a PowerPoint and some bits that you can download. And also, if you contact Nordic Model Now, they're able to go into schools to do assemblies as well. So if you have a child who's maybe sixth form age or coming to the end of secondary school, maybe year 11, that could be something to think about as well. So that kind of covers how you might want to approach it from a school angle. Now let's think about how you can have a conversation with the child or young person in your life. So I would definitely recommend having a look at the Culture Reframed website. They have free courses, online courses for parents and caregivers, and they are aimed at parents with children of different ages. So you can pick the one that best suits the age of the child or young person in your life, and you can work your way through that content at your own pace. So I would definitely recommend having a look at that. It gives lots of information around talking to young people about pornography. Now, the bit that I've pulled out is an approach that I find particularly useful as a guide to how you can actually have those conversations. So it uses Bravely to help you remember it, but as you can see, the letters are not all the first letter, so sometimes it's still a bit tricky to remember. So the idea is, if we imagine a child comes up to you and asks about something, and your initial reaction is that's something to do with sex, relationships, or pornography, the first thing to do is breathe. Take a really deep breath and just say, okay, this is what we're going to talk about today. To then recognise and affirm. So that would be to say something along the lines of, oh, that's a really interesting question. It's always good to ask if you have those questions. To then check why they asked. And this step is super important because I think anyone who's ever had any dealings with children and young people will have found themselves in a situation at some point where you think they're talking about one thing and they are talking about something completely different. So they might say, the example that I often see on social media is a young person says, what does gaze mean? And a parent goes into a big description about homosexual relationships and when two people love each other, and it turns out that the child is talking about gaze with your eyes. So always ask why they've asked. That's a really interesting question. What makes you ask that? Then investigate what it is that they already know. So a kind of a good rule of thumb is to try not to tell them anything that they don't know until you've got everything that they do know. So you can then, next one, evaluate where you're going to go with it. So if, for example, a young person asked, what does this word mean? You go back to them and say, oh, okay, well, what do you think it means? To find out how much knowledge they already have. The evaluate would also include deciding if this is the right time to have this conversation. So again, anyone who's had any experience of children or young people will know that they can pick the most inappropriate moment to ask a question. When you're dishing up dinner, when you're just about to go to bed, just as the lesson ends, and all that kind of thing. So evaluate, is this a good time? If it's not, to say, this is a really important question. This is really something that we want to talk about. Let's make sure that we get some time later that we can talk about that. And then tell it like it is. So that would be giving the child or young person factual information. So using the correct terminology for body parts, and giving them the facts as they relate to law or anything else. And then the last one is share your opinions, values, and beliefs. So this can be where it can feel quite difficult sometimes for parents, because they want to share their opinions, values, and beliefs sometimes right at the beginning and just say, well, you shouldn't be looking at that. You shouldn't be doing that. Once you've had the rest of the conversation, hopefully you can get to the point where you can just say, and what I think about this is this, or some people would think this. So what I'm going to do is just illustrate to you, using a case study, how this might work. Now, I've got a few case studies throughout the presentation. They are based on real things that could happen, but they're not real people. So they are examples based on my experience of working with young people, but these are not specific individuals in order to protect everyone's anonymity and confidentiality. So they're like amalgamated examples. Okay, so let's imagine we have a young woman, let's say she's 15 years old, and she says to her teacher, Miss, do you think sunflowering hurts? Now, the approach to this, using the Bravely model, would be to say, oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not really sure what that means. Now, in this example, the young person says, oh, sunflowering, that's when someone puts their hand inside you and opens it up like a sunflower. The response might then be, okay, well, what do you think? Do you imagine that that would hurt? The response is likely to be, yes, it probably would. Now, what you can then do from there is say, I'm really interested in why you asked that, to try and find out where the idea of this act has come from in the first place. You might then be told, oh, a friend was talking about it, or I saw something online, which can then lead you to evaluate, is there another conversation that needs to be had here? Is there something more about safeguarding, or is there something more about accessing content, or is this a young person being curious? And then if you've evaluated this is a good time to have this conversation, you can say it like it is. Doing that to someone is likely to really, really injure them. It would be my view that that would not be something that someone who was kind and considerate and loving towards you would want to do to you. And then you can see how the conversation goes from there. So I think Bravely can be a really handy way to help you manage some of those tricky conversations. Okay, so moving on, how can we encourage young people to speak up if they feel unsafe? So I think something to bear in mind is that when some children and young people are exposed to a lot of sexualized and pornified culture, so be that music videos or TV or books or whatever it is, when they're exposed to a lot of that culture, it trains them to ignore their own feelings of being unsafe and being concerned. So what I mean by that is, for children, when something is normalized, they can think, well, everyone else feels okay about this. So I should feel okay about this too. So I'm going to ignore this feeling that I have. And that's something that we want to, as adults who work with or care for children and young people, kind of just push back against and really encourage children to trust their gut feelings and what their nervous system tells them about feeling unsafe. So one way of doing this, and anyone who has primary school children may be aware of this approach already, is the idea of what are called protective behaviours. So the main idea behind protective behaviours is that everyone has the right to feel safe at all times, and it's okay to talk to someone about any problem. So that can work in your home, it can work in schools and colleges, it can work in clubs and extracurricular activities. Everyone has the right to feel safe. And whatever problem you have, you can tell someone about it, you can tell an adult about it. Now, that doesn't mean that there will always not be consequences, because some of it might be that you've done something that that means that you need to have a sanction for that. It doesn't mean that there won't be consequences, but it does mean that someone will always help you. So they may not be happy about what you've done, but they will always help you with what has happened. So the ways of promoting protective behaviours with children and young people is to firstly recognise in your body the signs of being unsafe. So that might be noticing if your heart is racing, or if you feel suddenly very hot or suddenly very cold, if you feel shaky, if you feel wobbly. And then really helping children and young people to recognise when that kind of feeling is excitement and it's fun, and when it's fear and it's not as much fun. So an example might be if someone is queuing up to get onto a roller coaster. They may feel really excited because they want to be on that roller coaster and it's going to be so much fun. They may also feel a little bit nervous, but it's a fun kind of nervous. If you then compare that to someone is around another person and they get a feeling of unease, they can think, is this excitement or is this something else? So it's listening to your body and the signs it gives you that you're not safe. It then, another part of protective behaviours is being able to talk to children and young people about understanding body boundaries. So the version that I use for this is to say safe, unsafe, and unwanted touch. So sometimes the approach to this is to talk about good and bad touch. For me personally, that doesn't work. My background is partly in supporting survivors of sexual violence, and it's very difficult sometimes to differentiate when something that was bad and unsafe felt good. So my preference is to use safe, unsafe, and unwanted touch. This also works better, I think, because some unwanted touch is actually safe. So if you think about if you have to have a medical procedure or you have to go to the dentist, you might not want that person to be touching your teeth. You might not want that person to be examining you, but in that situation, it is safe. And the way that you can recognize it's safe is that if you are a child and you go into the doctors, there'll usually be an adult with you. Or if you're old enough to go to the doctors on your own, the doctor or dentist will explain to you what it is that they're doing. So understanding when a touch is safe, when it's unsafe, and when it's unwanted can be a way to help children and young people recognise that their body is their own and people can't just touch you when they feel like it. The next part of protective behaviours would be helping children and young people to know their support networks and their trusted adults. So for lots of children and young people that I work with, say they live with their parents, but there are some things that they feel they can't talk to their parents about, either because their parents would be angry or they'd be upset and they don't want to cause their parents to have any difficult feelings. So it might be thinking about, well, who are the other trusted adults in your life that you could speak to? And that might be teachers at school, it might be youth group leaders, it might be social workers, it might be mum's best friend, it might be dad's boss, depending on what the setup is in the family. Another really important thing, I think, to help children understand is that they can persevere when adults don't listen or understand. So we often talk about, or children will often hear adults in their lives saying, you can tell me anything, you can come and tell me. And then when they do make a disclosure or tell something or say to an adult, I feel uncomfortable about this, or I saw something and I don't understand it, the adult will be doing something else and they dismiss it, or they misunderstand what the child is saying and they dismiss it. So letting children know that just because one adult doesn't listen to you doesn't mean that you shouldn't just go and say the same thing to another one. Just keep going until you feel that you have been heard. And then the last thing on protective behaviours is having safety plans and emergency plans. So a safety plan would be working out in a particular situation, if a certain thing happened, what can you do? So your safety plan might say, if you're around a friend's house and you feel uncomfortable and you want to come home, what do you do? And then you would include the person that you could contact, the way that you would contact them, and maybe even the code that you would use between you, so that that adult knows, I need you to come and get me. It might be having a safety plan around if someone sends me something on Snapchat that that makes me feel uncomfortable, that I don't like, who am I going to tell about it? And then emergency plans would be, what do you do in an absolute emergency when nothing else has worked? And for children and young people, there are a range of services that they can contact to speak to someone. So Childline, Shout and Couth, for example, are all services who specialise in helping young people. Okay, so just to give you a case study, another example of why I think it's so important to help children to understand that they should trust their gut and that they should just keep asking until an adult helps them out. So let's imagine we've got a young person and something happens at school, they overhear a conversation or a lesson goes on and they think, I want to know how to have a baby. So they go home, they get their iPad out and they Google, how do you have a baby? And because there's no restrictions on the iPad, lots and lots of content comes out that isn't age appropriate to a child, about sex education, but is actually pornographic in content. So then that child is in a situation where they have then seen a lot of stuff. They probably don't know what it is. They probably don't understand what it is, and it's likely to be quite scary. Now, in terms of protective behaviours, we would hope that that child would have gone to an adult in the first instance to say, can you tell me how you have a baby? But even at this point, if they could go to an adult and say, I saw some stuff on the internet, I don't know what it is, I'd like some help to understand it. Now, if that child isn't able to do that, potentially what happens is they are then ignoring their own feelings of uncertainty. They may well be Googling more stuff, going back to look at that stuff again to try and make sense of it, to the point where, as we know how internet algorithms work, they get shown more and more extreme content until it gets more and more confusing and more scary. So encouraging children to be able to trust their gut. If you feel uncomfortable, if you've got a question, it's always okay to ask an adult. And at any point in the example we've used, at any point, ask an adult for help. Okay, so our next question is, I think it's our last question. How can you support children and young people to recognise the harms of pornography and the sex trade? And this is probably the most difficult one, or the one that people ask me about the most. Well, how can I have this conversation? So I think one of the things that we've already covered that you can do is to be open and try and be the person that the child or young person in your life can come to with any questions they have. That's a really good kind of first step. And as I said, with protective behaviours, there's not a guarantee that there aren't going to be consequences for some things, but we're always going to be able to talk about what's happened. Okay. The next thing I think that can be really, really useful generally as something to do is to encourage children and young people to become critical consumers. So young people have media images pumped at them pretty much constantly. So there's adverts everywhere. Most of the apps and things they use will have ads. So they are seeing a lot of media content pretty much all the time. And just like not knowing what's age appropriate and what's not age appropriate, children won't know what is going on with adverts and other media products unless someone helps them understand it. So one approach that we can take with this is media analysis with young people. So that would be when you are watching TV or a young person mentions a song that they've listened to, or they mention a music video that they've listened to, that you open up a kind of discussion about that as a media product. So let's imagine you see an image and it's a sexualized image. You might say, what do you think the purpose of this image is? Why do you think this product was made? Is it trying to sell us something? So if you think about lots of advertising will be selling not just the product, but also a lifestyle. So it will be selling kind of an aspirational lifestyle. A lot of music does that as well. So you might say to them, what do you think they're trying to sell us here? And then you might move on to say, what do you think the message of this is? What are they trying to make us think about ourselves and about the world? How is this produced? Do you think this was staged? Do you think this is real? Who made it? Who else was involved in it? Now, this is a particularly interesting question, I think, in the age of social media, where so much is filtered, and especially in the age of AI, where so much is fake, to be able to say, do we even think this is a real thing? How has this product been produced? And then you might look at what its meaning is. What does it say about the people in it? How are women represented? How are people from minority ethnic backgrounds represented? How are people from different demographics represented in this product? And is it trying to promote to us a particular ideology? Is it telling us that we should think a certain thing about those people? And then to consider, has this media product got any relevance to you? Is the message in this product going to improve your life in any way? So if you think about in terms of how you could use this, and I'm definitely not suggesting you sit down and you watch something and then analyze it in this way, but if young people or children come up to you and they say, I saw this music video, this was happening in it, this is a way of saying, oh, that's interesting. What do you think it's telling us about the different people in it? So it's a way of opening up a conversation that hopefully doesn't come across as critical to the young person, as in you're criticizing them for liking it, because you're just asking some questions and asking them to think about it in a different way. Also, some ways that you can kind of question what's going on. So if a child or young person shares a view or an opinion that is something that you find challenging, or is something that potentially could get them have consequences for them if they express that in school or out in the wider world, some ways of gently kind of questioning that. So if they share a view, checking their understanding and saying, oh, you said that, what does that mean to you? Or if they've used particular words, oh, do you know what that word means? I think I have been in lots and lots of situations over the years where children have used sexually explicit swear words. And when I've checked in with them, do you know what that word means? They've heard it, but they have no real idea of the context of the word or how it might be perceived by other people. So just checking in first, what does that mean to you? And I think saying, what does that mean to you, allows them to kind of give their interpretation and for you to evaluate whether you're on the same page or whether you think something quite different. The next thing is to check the context. So saying, okay, what makes you say that? Or, oh, where did you hear that? Or where's that view come from? Or what's influenced you to think that? And that way you can start to get an idea whether this, the thing that they're saying has come from people in their family, or whether it's come from a lesson at school, whether it's come from something they've accessed on the media, whether it's come from something that they've seen online. So you get more of a context of like, well, what is it that we're actually talking about here? And then a gentle challenge. So if it's something that you think this view is one that I actually don't agree with, or this view is something that I'm worried if they expressed it elsewhere could have negative consequences for them, you can start to say, well, do you think everybody thinks that? Or do you think other people would say the same? What other views might people have? How might that view, for example, impact women and girls? Or what might the consequences be of having that view? Now, anyone who's ever spent time, particularly with adolescents, will know sometimes they will absolutely dig their heels in. They will double down. And these kind of questions, I find, help that conversation not to get heated as quickly, because you're just opening up a conversation. It's not a personal criticism of what they're saying. So let's have a little look at an example. So say, for example, as has happened to me lots and lots of times when I've had conversations about consent and pornography in schools with young people. Let's say the view is expressed, females get paid a lot to be in porn, they don't have to do it. Now, taking the approach of saying, oh, what is it that makes you say that, allows that young person to then expand on that. So rather than you going straight back with, that's not true, only some get paid a lot, they don't have to do it, but there's a lot more to it than that. And it starts to get heated very quickly, coming back and saying, oh, what is it that makes you say that? And then they may say, I saw something online and this person made this amount of money. You can then say, oh, okay, yeah, that could well be the case. Do you think that's the case for everybody? And then rather than kind of coming back at them with research projects and literature reviews and research that's been done, you get to have a conversation that helps you know more about where that young person is coming from. And hopefully they will then see from that role modeling of how you're talking about it that they can have conversations about these things. So taking this example, if the person says, you know, females get paid a lot to be in porn, and you might say, oh, what makes you say that? And then they cite in particular porn performers. You might say, oh, I'm sure that is the case. I just wonder if it's the case for all people who are involved in the porn industry. I wonder how that industry works. When they say they don't have to do it, that's an opportunity to open up a conversation about, oh, it's a really interesting idea. What other things do you think people don't have to do but might feel pressured to do? And then rather than trying to teach that child your view on what you think that they should think, you're able to have a discussion, and they may walk away from you still having the same view, but you'll have done what I like to call planted some seeds that there are other points of view that are possible. Now, not particularly this example, but there might be some examples where young people express views that actually could get them into trouble because they are, you know, forms of harassment or discrimination. And in that case, you can always say, I hear what you're saying. I just need you to know that were you to express that view at school, you probably wouldn't be able to have this kind of conversation about it. or were you to express that view in the street and people were to hear you, there may be different consequences. What do you think the consequences of that view might be for other people? Okay, that has been quite a whistle-stop tour there. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing now. So hopefully that's gone off your screen. I think Emily is going to come back now. And
I am. Hi, Helen.
Say something. So over to you, Emily.
Hello, Helen. Thank you so much. That was a wealth of resources and information. Lots of advice about how to talk to your children about what are really difficult areas to navigate. Having given you a tiny little break there, I'm now going to ask you some of the questions that have come in during the chat, and have come in before the webinar as well. So the first question we had, which was a practical question from Jane during your talk, was if you have any particular recommendations for ways to restrict internet access for children in age-appropriate ways. Are there any particular tools you'd recommend?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say if they have a smartphone, particularly an iPhone, if you go into the settings, and usually if you search something like screen time or screen limits, you can do all kinds of wonderful things. So you can restrict the websites that they can access. So you can actually put in websites that they're never allowed to access, or ones that they're only allowed to access. And you can also put limits on, so the phone will close down at a certain time at night. It will close down. An app will close down after they've used it for a certain amount of time. So I'd say in terms of phones and smartphones, whichever device the child or young person in your life has, I'd say it's definitely worth Googling specifically how you put those restrictions on. So that's one way. Another way is, so if you have a laptop, for example, or tablets or that kind of thing, depending on the age of the child, you may want to put a kind of contract agreement in place, which is the laptop is used in family areas, or the laptop is used in an area where someone else is. So laptop does not go to your bedroom, tablet doesn't go to your bedroom. As children get older, and especially post-COVID, schools rely a lot on children having devices to be able to do their homework. It might be that you have an agreement to check their search history and all that kind of thing. Now, I would say, with the best will in the world, you could put every restriction in place going. You could monitor their internet use, all kinds of things. What is really, really hard to do is to monitor the things that they are shown by other people. So I think also, as well as kind of putting some of those speed bumps back in as far as you can, the reason I think it's so important to kind of be open to be able to talk about things is because there will always be an instance where you are unable to protect your child from seeing inappropriate content. So always having that safety net of, if you do see something, this is how we deal with it.
Thanks, Helen. As you say, there are the speed bumps you put in place, but you can't control the fact that information will come from other places. And so you need to have those conversations ready as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
For that. We have another question. How do parents counteract what's called the sex positive, anything goes attitude in secondary school PHSE?
Okay, so I think this is a super interesting one because, and there's lots of different ways to approach it depending on the person, your personality kind of thing. So I think one thing you can do is have a dialogue with the school and ask what it is that is being taught in those lessons. So from my experience of being a teacher, PSHE tends not to, or whatever it's called in different schools, tends not to be taught by anyone with a specialist subject background. So whereas, for example, I'm just picking a random subject, geography teacher is likely to have a background in geography and that's their specialism, that tends not to be the case for PSHE. So what happens is you might get some people who teach PSHE because they have a background in a similar kind of area. So that might be in health and social care or childcare or sociology, something like that. Or you'll get people who have a gap in their timetable and they need to have one period in order to fill up their allotted time. So what can happen then is it can be in some schools really hit and miss on what that lesson is going to be like, because it absolutely depends on who has prepared that lesson and how confident the teacher is in having the conversation. So what some schools do is they will bring in outside organisations to cover certain aspects. So what you are able to do as a parent is to say to the school, I'd like to know how those lessons are organised. So I'd like to know who it is that's teaching them, what their specialism is, who's planning those lessons, what the content is, and if you're involving any outside organisations, I'd really like to know who they are, how they've been selected, and if you have checked the content of that session before those people came in. All of those are perfectly legitimate things for parents to be able to do. So that's one approach that you can take. I think the other approach that you can take is to consider that even if the content of the PSHE lessons was absolutely what you wanted to be, the ideas that you personally might not agree with are going to come into that young person's life somehow anyway. So being in a position to have those conversations, to say, oh, so what was it that you covered today? Oh, that's interesting. Do you think everyone thinks that? You know, that curious questioning. So there's a kind of quite forthright, information-driven approach to say, I'd like the school to tell me everything that's going on. And then there's also the kind of, I would like to be able to have conversations with the young person in my life that they can tell me this stuff and we can maybe not always have a calm conversation. Sometimes it might get quite passionate. And I think the other thing to bear in mind, especially when you're dealing with adolescents, is if they agree with your point of view, that's super surprising. So that kind of part of the job of the adolescent is to challenge the views of the older generation, their parents. So I think the idea that what is considered acceptable and normal in terms of sex and sexual relationships, and even in terms of pornography, has massively changed over time. So things that young people maybe engage in now that to them is absolutely normal, for someone my age or someone my parents' age just would not have even been a thing. So also bearing in mind that to some extent you are kind of challenging a progression that's always happened. So you have to, I guess, kind of acknowledge that to say, yeah, they're going to think I'm a fuddy-duddy. They're going to think I'm a prude. They're going to think I don't know anything about sex. They're going to think that I'm all of these things, just like I thought about the people who came before me. So just keeping some context for yourself. I don't know if that's answered that. I feel like that's the answer I'm giving anyway.
I think it did. Thanks, Helen. Just kind of building on that then in terms of how to talk to children. Somebody asked for some more specific help on the kind of language they should use to explain to their children why pornography isn't appropriate for children and possibly for older children, to ensure that that kind of conversation doesn't shame the child or stigmatize the child for their interest, I suppose, but how to explain that it's got to be age appropriate and what's not age appropriate.
Yes, I think one way of approaching that without making it personal and without blaming or shaming the child is to say, as a society, we set limits, age limits on lots and lots of different things. So we say that you can't vote until you're 18 because we don't think your brain is developed and you've not had enough life experience. We say that you can't have sex until you're 16. We say that you can't drive until you're 17. So as a society, that is something that we do. We put age restrictions on them. And whether we agree that the age is right or not, because we know people mature at different rates, that's the society that we live in. And as a society, our lawmakers, government, have decided that this is the age. So 18 is the age you become a legal adult. And then you can have some really fun conversations about what age do you think you should be when you can vote. So I think putting it in a context of this isn't me having a go at you. This is me saying this is how the world works. And different countries might have different ideas, but generally across the world, it's 18 for pornography. So if a child is younger than that, particularly significantly younger than that, you can say that's something for adults. When you're an adult, you'll be able to make a choice about what you do. At the moment, you are not an adult, and if you're a parent or caregiver, and it is my job to keep you safe, and part of my job keeping you safe is to make sure that you don't see stuff that doesn't suit your age. Now, when you get to children or young people rather who are older, so they're not 18, but they're 15, 16, 17, you can definitely have that conversation about we have age restrictions. I think it gets trickier then because we've had, as a society, so much erosion of those age restrictions. So people play video games that are 18 when they're much younger. People get to see films, those speed bumps have gone. And that's when I think it does have to be some of those difficult conversations about, and this is all covered in the Culture Reframe stuff. So if you can do one of those online courses, I would definitely recommend them. They're really good. You can basically open up the conversations about this is not what a real relationship is like. This is not what real sex is like. And if you've done some of that media analysis, this is all fake. You can do it with that. This is all fake. This is not real. Now, there is also another organisation that I've just thought of called Fight the New Drug. And they have resources on their website very much around the impact on adolescent brains and things like that. So you might be, so when I've done sessions on pornography in schools, it's never been you shouldn't watch this, it's wrong, because that's massively shaming and really not helpful for those young people. It's very much about like, what do you think of this idea? What do you think? This research showed this. What do you make of that? And again, it's like planting those seeds to say, I'm not, because anyone who spent any time with adolescents, if you think that they're just going to take what you say, then please, can I meet those ones? You plant some of the seeds. And I think the thing to definitely remember is, even if they're saying to you, you are wrong, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, those seeds are planted. They may walk away, think about it some more, might mention it to a friend might say something else, and there's stuff going on. So it would be amazing, but it's highly unlikely they're going to verbalize and tell you to your face that you are right and they agree with you unconditionally, and it's going to be a beautiful time. But just because they haven't agreed with you doesn't mean they're not thinking about it.
We had another question which related maybe to the step before this, which is parents trying to work out what their children have seen. So the question was, what should you do if a child feels embarrassed or doesn't want to talk to you about their exposure to pornography? How do you gauge how much they understand about what they've already seen when you're effectively questioning them about what they've seen so far?
Yeah, definitely. Good question. So I think the thing to bear in mind, and this is a very therapist answer, the thing to bear in mind is it probably doesn't matter that you know specifically what they've seen. And the reason I say that is because we don't want to create a hierarchy of saying, if you saw that, it was awful. If you saw that, well, that's not as bad, because we don't know the individual child and we don't know the impact it would have. So I would say, if you have suspicions that your child has seen something, you probably don't need to worry too much about getting hung up on what it is they've seen, because what you're interested in is the impact it's had on that young person and how you can help them move forward. So I would, for example, I work with young people, and as I say, this is in therapy, where I have no idea. I have no idea what it is that's happened for them to be there. They've had a referral. And for some young people I work with, we even use a code so that they don't have to talk about it because it's something that's so shameful or embarrassing or awkward. So we will talk about the thing or, that. So I think, so I guess my point would be, you don't have to get hung up on what it is they've seen. If you have concerns that what they've seen is illegal in terms of how they've accessed it, that would be a different conversation. But I would say you find out where they are, how are you feeling about this, and what would help you. So we know that this feels really awkward to talk about. I mean, I say to young people all the time, and I'm not their parent, I say to them all the time, oh, this is awkward, isn't it? Look at us here having to talk about this. Okay, let's just not look at each other. You can kind of acknowledge that this is not a conversation people particularly want to have, and ask them, right, this is a weird situation we're in. I'm worried that you might have seen something. What do you need from me? What would help you? And again, if they say nothing, I don't ever want to talk about it again. That doesn't mean the seed hasn't been planted, that is a person I can talk to about this. And it might be that it takes a bit of time, that they will appear at bedtime and go, I want to talk about it now. And when that happens, even though it's super awkward because children and young people do pick really difficult times, it's like, then you have to make the time. And if you can't do it then for like an absolutely genuine reason, it's like, this is really important and I do want to talk to you about it. And this is when we're going to do it because we can't do it now.
That's great, thank you. So pivoting slightly from parents and adults talking to the children in their lives, we had a question from someone about how effectively to help children talk to each other. So the question was, do you have any advice for helping teenagers to talk to their peers if their peers are pressuring them to watch pornography when they don't want to join in, or if kids are seeing their friends change, like sexualizing themselves through the impact of pornography? And if your children are worried about their friends, how can they talk to them?
Yeah, that is another really good question, because I think we often assume, because of how this issue is portrayed sometimes in the media, we often assume all the children are watching pornography, they're all fine with it, and nobody's worried. And I think in my experience, I spend all my time with children and young people, that's absolutely not the case. So there are lots of young people out there who are really worried about. So there was a TV show that was on, and it was in a school, and it was the bloke from Busted, and they took children's phones away, and they spoke about pornography, and they said, like whatever percentage of 9-year-olds have seen pornography. And that can be a really terrifying statistic to hear if you're a young person, because you start worrying about children. So I do think what we have to acknowledge is that not all children will be actively seeking out pornography to watch. Some young people will be really worried about it. Some will already be having conversations with their friends about things that they don't think are okay. And it's not as straightforward. So I think it can be really difficult when you are an adolescent to be the person who stands up to your friends, because the potential losses are massive. You could lose your friendship group. There are young people who are able to do that, and there are lots of young people who aren't able to do that. So I think there is a role for adults in that, which is to let those young people know that the views that they have that are contrary to their peers, it's fine to not always agree with everyone around you. And I think also the idea that you can be friends with people who have really different views to you on some topics. There might be some things where I can't be with that person, but it is fine to not always agree with everyone. So I think that's one thing that we can help young people understand. And I think the other thing that is a way to manage this particular topic is to really help young people know through validating and listening to them, whatever they say, is basically saying, you have got your belief system, and that is what you believe, and that is okay. And if it's different to the people around you, there might be some tough decisions, which is maybe I can't hang around with those people anymore, or maybe I need to have a conversation with them. But these are difficult conversations, and we can have difficult conversations. I sometimes worry that we get to the point where the pressure on young people from education, for example, is so immense, and the expectations of them is so great that we're at a point where it can be really difficult to have difficult conversations, but we can definitely do it. So let's practice it. Let's all try to get to a place where we can just talk about stuff and not fall out about it. But in terms of peers, it will be that way up of oh, you know, I know this is right in my heart, but these people don't. And sometimes you have to just say, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's not my responsibility to change everybody else.
We had a question about what might be even a more difficult direction for this kind of conflict in views to be coming from, which was not just peer-to-peer between children, but somebody asked, how is the best way for a mother to address the topic of pornography or specific acts in pornography in general with a young teenage son? And I'll give a bit more background. It gives you a moment's break as well.
Yeah.
He has a father who watches pornography, who says it's normal to watch porn and boys watch pornography and that's fine too. His father feels that his mother is overreacting and won't engage with any of the resources and literature that she's given to him. She feels as though she approaches the conversation calmly. It's not something she goes on about, but whenever she brings this up, she gets resistance and she's portrayed as being hysterical and as though she's overreacting to the situation. So I suppose sort of how does she deal with those conversations, probably both predominant with her son, but maybe also within the family context?
Yeah, I mean, that is a super tricky one because really what's happened is that son is in a position where he has to pick a parent to agree with, which for him, I would imagine, could feel like a really uncomfortable position to be in. So on the one hand, I would say, you know, ideally that disagreement, I don't know if disagreement's the right word, but that tension about pornography between the couple in an ideal world would be completely separate from their child, because that's an issue between them. If he is now in a situation where his dad is saying it's fine to watch porn, depending on the age of the son, that might be worrying, because if he's under 18, then technically it is illegal and that kind of thing. But I think in terms of the mum feeling like she is the one who's having to have these conversations, again, I would say a way, it's almost like an approach you could try is to almost slightly look at it from a different perspective, which is, I am sharing these views and this is what I believe in, and I can't force my son to agree or disagree with me. I can just provide the information and my outlook, and then the rest is down to him to process. The issue with the husband, or the boy's father, I think is almost like a separate issue, because if he is, and I don't know if this is what I don't think this is what the question said. So, but if he is kind of like speaking positively about pornography, or almost like saying it's normal or encouraging it, then that feels like a conversation to have with the boy's father rather than with the boy. So I think, and again, you know, this is a therapist looking at this, I would say, I would wonder how it feels for that boy to be between his two parents, have different views. And is there then more, and I'm not saying, you know, I'm not making any assumptions or judgments about the questioner, so this is just a general thing, you know, if as a family the alliance is with the dad anyway, then it might not be about pornography. I guess that's what I'm saying. So it feels like a much more complicated issue. So our most base response, I think, again, if you plant those seeds, if you drop that stuff in there, that's the best you can do. The more you push it, the bigger the resistance often comes. So leaving the door open for communication, trying to be as calm as you can, not always possible. And, you know, I think what we have to remember about young people is they're not like just blank slates that we can put stuff on. They have lots of other experiences. They'll have other people giving input. Sometimes we have to trust them and wait it out a little bit, unless it gets to the point there's a safeguarding concern, and then obviously that's a completely different story. Was that okay? I don't know.
Yeah, that was great. I know it's a specific situation in that family, and as you say, there may be a lot going on that's not specifically pornography related. You have talked a lot about how to facilitate these conversations between parents and children. Somebody asked specifically, what do they do when their teenage daughters, who are 15, 18 and 19, have the response that their parents' view of pornography is prudish? What do people do about accusations of prudery when that's how pushback comes?
Yeah, I mean, if you can't accuse your parents of being prudes, then I don't know where we are. So I do think, like, I don't mean to be flippant. I know this is probably very stressful. But I think that is, so if you look at even if you look at the last 100 years, attitudes towards sex, sexuality, gender roles, everything have shifted massively. And one thing that I have to do a lot, so I spend a lot of time with young people where they're talking about their relationships. And, I'm 48 years old. There are things that they say where I'm just like, I cannot even get my head around it, that is a thing that a 15-year-old even knows exists. Because when I was 15, there was no internet. There was, so I think on one part of it, in order to kind of keep your own emotional well-being, is to bear in mind there has been a massive shift in how young people understand sex, sexual relationships. And that is definitely not to say that I think it's been a good shift, but it is where we're at. The reality of the situation is young people see lots of acts, they see lots of pornified content that tells them certain things are normal. And those certain things for people of an older generation, so their parents, grandparents, just wouldn't not be normal. They wouldn't even be a thing that anyone had even thought of doing. So I think keeping it in the context, and also, again, bearing in mind, part of the job of adolescents and young people is to disagree with their parents, and even if they do agree with some of it, the likelihood they're going to tell you that might be slim. So keeping that context in mind. And again, I know I keep saying the same thing, but it's just because I think it's the only thing that works. Just because they're not agreeing with you doesn't mean they're not thinking about what you've said. So them knowing that you genuinely hold that belief and that you are passionate enough about it, or you are committed enough to it, or you just think it's right to say it, I think it is the way to take it. So I'm going to keep mentioning it. I'm going to, maybe not every night or at dinner time or whatever, but if it comes up that we see something in the media, or when there's opportunities, there's lots of opportunities when certain musicals are on, or when certain adverts happen, to be able to say, oh, look at that, and to open it up. So it's it's just not quick. That's the problem. It's just not quick. But I would say a big lesson I've learned from working with children and young people is, depending on who else is in the room, massively changes what they might say to you. So if they've got their other siblings there, if there's other family members there, if their friends are there, they may say certain things that if it was just you and them, they wouldn't say. So not necessarily, yes, I guess the big part is, don't assume because they're tutting and rolling their eyes and saying, oh, you're going on about it again, that they're not listening to what you're saying, and that at some point it might not be useful to them. And I think in terms of safety and safeguarding, that kind of thing as well, if that what you're basically telling that young person by showing that concern is that should anything ever feel uncomfortable, you are a person that they can speak to about it. Because you're not going to be like, why were you even doing that? You're going to be like, okay, right, now we can have a conversation about it. But it's a tricky one, and yeah, it takes ages, and it's really annoying. Why don't they just listen the first time?
If only. You actually read my mind there at the end by talking about safeguarding. I was about to ask, we had a couple of questions tending more in that direction. Somebody's asked what they should say to their child, or what they should do when they're worried that their child has seen something illegal, but they don't want to talk about it and they don't want to say what it is. And I know you said that what they see specifically for general conversations doesn't matter, but if you have a particular concern, how should you go about having that conversation?
Yeah, so I think for this one, where it can get particularly tricky for children and young people is if someone in their peer group or has sent them something, it doesn't just become about that thing, which in this example we're going to say is some kind of illegal content. It's the ripples of what telling would cause. So say, for example, and I'm just making this up, let's say a young person sent someone else a piece of an image, an indecent image of a child, because that will happen quite frequently in schools. If that child who received that then goes and tells a teacher, it gets reported to safeguarding, everybody's parents gets called, the child who sent it says to the other child, I'm never going to speak to you again. And the ripples of that are much bigger. So that's partly why I think a lot of children are super reluctant to share specifics. They also think, and I think it's worth bearing in mind, lots of children, often with no evidence at all, think they will get in trouble. So they'll be like, well, if I tell you, then I'm going to be in trouble, even though I wasn't the one who did it. So I think understanding the fear levels involved in it. And I think if you are concerned that your child has seen something that is illegal content, but you've got no idea where it came from, in terms of safeguarding, if it's come from another young person or if it's come from someone online, I do think, I don't know if this would be super straightforward in all situations, but there needs to be some kind of heavy monitoring of the devices. So if we're saying they've been sent something web-based, so what I'm thinking is I should probably be more specific so that makes sense. So if you're worried that an adult has sent your child something, then I would say you have to monitor their devices, because the potential for grooming there has, that door's been opened. So the child may not like it. I would say, and this might be controversial, in my experiences, it's never been a good idea to take the devices away completely, because the potential there is that you open the door to someone who is unsafe to give that child or young person a device. So if you monitor the device, you don't want them to just get another phone, basically. So that's just as an aside. So you might want to monitor their devices. I do think, again, letting them know in those protective behaviours stuff, which is everyone has a right to feel safe and it is okay to talk about any problem. Just like really reiterating that things may not go the way you want them to, and it will be better for everyone's safety. So a way to approach some of these issues is to talk to children about safety. The important thing here is you are safe, your friend is safe, the other children are safe. This isn't about trying to get you in trouble. This isn't about thinking you're a good or bad person. This isn't about whether you're morally right or wrong. This is about, are you safe? And as the adults in your life, it is our job to keep you safe. If there is something unsafe going on, we acknowledge it is super, super difficult for you to tell us for lots of reasons, and you can tell us. If you can't tell us, these are the other people in your support network. So can you tell Nana? Can you tell Dad's best mate? Can you tell the neighbour? Like, it doesn't matter who is the trusted adult in your life who can help you with this thing. And the young person or the child will often pick someone who they think can handle it. because children are really, really perceptive about having an emotional impact on adults in their lives. So they'll pick an adult who can handle it. It might be they think, like I'm saying, it's not necessarily correct. They might think you can't handle it, or you'll be disappointed in them. So working through that protective behaviour stuff, who can you tell? And it's okay to tell them.
And somebody else also asked, in relation to what children might have seen, if there are any signs or red flags that parents should look for to know if their child has been exposed to harmful online content. I suppose that's part of a bigger conversation, but I wonder if you have any tips.
Yeah, I mean, what you'd be looking out for, and this wouldn't kind of be, this specifically would signal online content, but you would be looking for any kind of changes in behaviour that are unusual. Now, that is a super easy thing to say, but anyone who lives particularly with an adolescent will be like, that's every day. There is a change in their entire personality and mood every day. But basically, you're just looking for anything that just feels a bit off. So it might be that their sleep is disturbed. So either they struggle getting to sleep, they're waking up a lot, or they're complaining of nightmares, but kind of any issues around sleep, and also issues around eating. So either they are not eating as much, their appetite is gone, or they're snacking a lot more, and that kind of thing. So changes in kind of sleeping and eating, I would say, are big ones. Changes in mood, like I say, a little bit more difficult with adolescents, but if they're snappy, irritable, more argumentative, if they're secretive about their phone or their devices, they're not wanting you to look at them, or they're putting them away quickly, or they're shutting down the laptop when you come in. So really, you're looking for any kind of behaviours where you as a parent or caregiver would be like, that's not how you normally are. As I say, you can't definitely say that is because of, it could be because of issues at school, but it could be, you're looking basically for signs of that anxiety has been provoked, that fear responses have been provoked, but changing demeanour, changing attitude, changing normal behaviours is a good place to start. And then rather than just assume, like I say, you can't assume that's online content. So I wouldn't suggest you say to them, what have you seen? But you could say something like, I noticed that you're really off your dinner lately. I wonder if there's anything that's worrying you. They might then just go, no, it's none of your business. But they know that you've noticed, and that opens the door for them to then say, actually, there might have been something, but it might take a little while.
Thanks, Helen. I have got one final question for you, I think, and that was from somebody who wanted to know if you have any particular resources you'd recommend for therapists like yourself working with children and young people dealing with these kinds of issues.
Interesting. So I think that if you are, depending on kind of what kind of therapist you are, but if you have any kind of person-centered approach in your repertoire, I think that is the tool that you are best to use. So that kind of open curiosity, that absolutely non-judgmental approach that you can share anything and it will only be passed on if there's a safeguarding concern. So I think a person-centered approach can be really handy in allowing young people to share in the first instance. For those of you who are not therapists, you might not know what that means, but it basically means you're non-judgmental. You've got unconditional positive regard for the person. So whatever they tell you, it doesn't change how you respond to them, and you have empathy. So I think those skills are really, really important. The other thing I think that's super important for therapists working with children and young people, so I specialise in children and young people, I think it's really important for the therapists who are working with children and young people to kind of keep up to date with what is going on in the world. So I'm not saying that you absolutely can't work with people if you don't know what they're talking about. You can, but having some idea by doing webinars like this of what is happening in the world. And you can do that really easily by like signing up to the Culture Reframed newsletter. They'll send stuff out, kind of, just reading the news, there's often articles. I listen to a lot of podcasts. There's the Fight the New Drug podcast called Consider Before Consuming, and just kind of keeping in touch with what are the things that young people might bring up and what is their understanding. Now, if, for example, I know, Emily, you said the next webinar is on OnlyFans. So if, for example, a young person brings up OnlyFans, I do still think you should say, oh, tell me about that, or what does that mean to you? Because you don't want to make assumptions. But yeah, I would say the two big ones for therapists would be just keeping true to those person-centered principles, and also just keeping an eye out of what's going on in the world. I would say that, yeah, there's loads of really good podcasts, and a lot of them are kind of entertainment-based podcasts, so they're relatively easy to listen to, kind of thing. Louis Theroux has done a couple with women who are like either performers in pornography or work in the sex trade, and they give some really, really interesting perspectives, I think, that help you be able to kind of have an idea of what's going on in the world that might impact young people.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. So we're going to end our questions there. And just to say, Helen, thank you. We're incredibly grateful for sharing your time and experience today. We've had a lot of compliments in the chat about your presentation, about your answers to people's questions. And I know that people have got an enormous amount out of listening to you speak today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And I'll see you all later.
Thank you. So before we finish, I'd just like to let everyone watching know about some resources to help parents with the issues we've been dealing with today, and to tell you about our next webinar, which is about OnlyFans, as Helen and I said. The webinar is called Easy Money or Excuse for Abuse, How OnlyFans Broke Down the Boundaries of a Generation. Now, I am just going to show you some resources which we recommend for parents and anyone dealing with these issues. Some of these are ones that Helen mentioned earlier. Culture Reframed is one that she highly recommends, and we agree. Helen's own website. ICENA is another organisation Helen mentioned, and Fight the New Drug. Just to let everyone know, I will post a list of all the resources that Helen's mentioned today and that we've talked about with the recording of the video when we post it online. So if anyone wants to come back and look at those resources, they'll be able to do that. Now, this is the slide for our next webinar, which will be on OnlyFans, as I say, in February on the 23rd. So I hope that as many of you as possible will be able to come to that. OnlyFans survivor Roxy Roots and feminist activist Ellie Arrow will be discussing the issues set out on the advert, and asking what OnlyFans means for the women, the men and the children involved, and for us as a wider society. The webinar's free, but you do need to register on Eventbrite in order to be able to attend. Finally, please follow Nordic Model Now and share and promote our material. We're at Nordic Model Now on social media, and our website is nordicmodelnow.org, which has a ton of information, and a lot of these resources are there. So please look us up. It only remains for me to thank everybody for coming along and listening, to thank Helen again for her fantastic work, and to invite you to join us next time in February for our OnlyFans webinar. We're going to end the recording now. Thank you.